Welcome! In this video, I'm going to show you how to sew a super basic elastic mask for donation to places that do not require certain patterns. You will need 2 pieces of cotton fabric, preferably one solid and one patterned, cut 9 inches by 6 inches. 2 pieces of elastic band. I have mine cut to 7 inches, but in the description I have various sizes listed if you want to alter that. Some cutting tools, a tool to poke out your ends and your edges. This is just a Cricut tool that I have, but you can use a chopstick, some pins. You'll also need an iron and your sewing machine. If you're making in bulk, I suggest pre-cutting your elastic and your fabric. That way you're all ready to go. Setting up my machine, I leave it on just that basic setting, nothing fancy, straight stitch, normal tension, normal widths. I always start sewing on the long side. So my pattern is 9 inches wide, but I've seen some people go up to 10 inches on their patterns because men usually have larger faces and having the fabric wider is more comfortable for them. After the long sides are sewn, insert your elastic band into your short side. I leave it exactly even with the edge of the fabric there. To conserve fabric, I'm using 1/4 inch seams along every edge. Start off going a little bit slower over your elastic and always double stitch over it to make sure it's locked in and isn't going to fall out after multiple uses. After sewing down about 1.5 inches, stop and give a 2-inch gap. That way you can make sure you can turn your work right side out once you're done sewing the edges. And then repeat for the bottom elastic band. On the other short side, you can sew straight down without skipping a gap. Here I am demonstrating chain stitching. If you're doing your masks in batches like I recommend, I would start with chain stitching your long ends. That way you don't have to stop and cut your work. It saves a lot of time and thread. To chain stitch, you leave your first mask on your sewing machine with your needle just after your fabric, and then you insert your next mask right after that. That way there's only a little bit of threaded gap in between them. Once you've worked through all the masks in your batch, you can cut all of those apart and chain stitch on the next side. With all the edges sewn, I trim the threads covering the opening where I can turn my work easier. And then I trim the edges to make sure that when I turn my work right side out, all of the corners are nice and square. Once that's done, I turn my work right side out, giving a good tug on the elastic, just kind of as a quality check to make sure that it's not going to fall out later. And then I use my tool to poke out the ends and run along the edges. The next step over at your ironing board is to turn those edges where you turned your work inside. That way you don't have any raw fabric showing, and then iron your mask. Making it nice and flat will make the pleating step, which comes next, a lot easier. When ironing, try to avoid going over your elastic. Pull out your pins because now we're going to pleat our mask. Fold it not quite in half, leaving about 1/2 inch from the bottom. Flip it back on its front and start pinching those pleats up. It takes a little bit of finesse. I've heard that this is one of the hardest steps by far for most people. I have a whole video dedicated to pleating hacks if you'd like to view that. But as you put the pins in, make sure they're at least 1 inch away from the end. That way you can run them through your machine without taking the pin out. On my machine, I changed to a double stitch and slow the speed down. Since we're using a double stitch, it isn't necessary to backstitch over your ends. Also make sure that you're going slow over the pleats because it is a lot of fabric for your machine to get through. I sometimes even lift up the presser foot just a little bit to help feed it through. If you're batching, this is also a great step to do chain stitching on. With both sides of your pleats done, take out your pins and trim your ends. You now have a fully complete pleated elastic mask. A few variations you can do to your masks are a buttonhole on one side of the fabric. That way you have a filter insert pocket. Another is adding a noseband. Now both of these would need to be done before you start even sewing your fabric together, but the noseband would get sewn in on one piece of that fabric as well. I've also heard of a lot of people using interfacing and ironing that on as their very first step to one side of the fabric. As I said earlier, it is better to use two different fabric patterns so the person wearing it can establish an inside and an outside. If that's not an option, you can use two different color threads on your bobbin and your top. That way they can see red on the inside, blue on the outside, whatever colors you choose to use. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. If you want to see more of what I do, hit that subscribe button, and thanks for watching.